And then she said her name, Jasmine Crockett, and the room froze. For a brief, impossible moment, the Senate chamber held its breath. The shuffle of papers stopped. The usual murmur of side conversations vanished into an uneasy quiet. Elizabeth Warren stood beneath the harsh white lights, her figure framed against a sea of faces that suddenly didn't know where to look. Her tone was calm, deliberate, the kind that didn't need to rise to be heard. Representative Jasmine Crockett, she said again, slower this time, each syllable landing like a measured strike. A woman who reminded this nation what courage sounds like when truth is under fire. Across the room, heads lifted. Some eyes narrowed, others softened. The phrase lingered in the air, too heavy to brush aside. The tension wasn't loud, it was electric. It was the kind of silence that came not from respect, but from reckoning. Senators who'd once rolled their eyes at Crockett's fire now looked down at their notes. A few exchanged glances, unsure if they were witnessing a compliment or a confrontation. Because this was no ordinary moment. It wasn't just one senator praising another. It was an act of recognition that cut against the grain of power. Warren, known for her precision and composure, was choosing to name someone younger, newer, and unapologetically unfiltered, the kind of woman politics wasn't built to reward. And yet, here she was, giving Crockett her due. Some voices, Warren continued, remind us that strength isn't found in the volume of our words, but in their truth. A faint rustle swept the back benches. Cameras zoomed in. Every viewer, watching live, felt that shift, that invisible moment when admiration collides with discomfort. Because everyone knew what Warren was doing. She wasn't just speaking about one woman, she was challenging an entire culture that punished women like her for daring to sound unafraid. Outside, the headlines hadn't been written yet, but in that instant, you could feel the story forming. Something was breaking. Decorum, expectation, the old hierarchy of who gets to be praised in public. And as Warren's voice echoed through the hall, the question became inescapable. What made this moment so dangerous, so necessary, that even her rivals couldn't bring themselves to interrupt? But what led to this moment, and what she said next, would ripple far beyond Capitol Hill. To understand the silence that followed Warren's words, you have to understand the storm that came before them. Washington had been caught in a season of spectacle, hearings that felt more like reality shows, sound bites engineered for outrage instead of truth. Every week brought another viral clash, another moment where decency was drowned out by noise. And in the middle of that noise, Jasmine Crockett had emerged, sharp, poised, unwilling to bow to the theater. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room. She was the clearest. Where others reached for cameras, she reached for facts. And that made her dangerous. Because in an age addicted to drama, clarity threatens the performance. In the past months, her exchanges in congressional hearings had cut through the chaos. She faced interruptions, smirks, condescension, yet she never cracked. When critics mocked her tone, she answered with evidence. When pundits dismissed her intelligence, she dismantled their claims line by line, calmly, surgically. Clips of her composure spread online like wildfire, not because she shouted, but because she didn't have to. And Elizabeth Warren noticed. For decades, Warren had carried the torch for moral clarity in politics, a woman who turned policy into poetry, intellect into empathy. Her voice carried weight not just because of seniority, but because she used it sparingly, deliberately. When Warren spoke a name on the Senate floor, it wasn't flattery. It was an elevation, a declaration. That's why this moment mattered. It wasn't just one senator commending another. It was a coded message to every woman who'd ever been told to soften her truth. It was a rebuke to the arrogance that mocked passion as unprofessional, to the pundits who mistook authenticity for anger. Few realized in that moment. Warren wasn't just speaking to Jasmine Crockett. She was speaking for her, for every voice pushed to the margins, for every woman who'd learned to hold her own silence until someone in power decided to break theirs. And yet, not everyone welcomed that silence. Because the more one woman was praised, the more others felt exposed. But to understand why the room went silent, you have to meet the forces that wanted her voice buried. The enemy was never a single face or party. It was the culture that wore arrogance like armor. In the marbled halls of Congress, condescension had become a language of its own. It lived in the smirk that followed a woman's question, the chuckle when she raised her voice, the casual interruption disguised as procedure. Power, here, didn't always shout. Sometimes, it simply waited for you to run out of breath. Jasmine Crockett had seen it all, the sideways glances when she challenged a colleague's false claim, the polite dismissal that followed her every sharp point. To them, confidence in a woman like her was a provocation. Her eloquence wasn't praised, it was dissected. Her assertiveness wasn't admired, it was labeled emotional. Clips of these moments made their way online. Freeze frames of Crockett mid-sentence, captions twisted to feed the algorithm. Pundits built entire segments around her expressions, mocking her intensity, calling her unhinged, performative, too passionate to be credible. They called it commentary. But it was spectacle, a theater of discomfort, designed to remind her, and women like her, that the room was not made for them. Inside the chamber, the hierarchy was clear. Men with years of tenure mistook their tone for truth, mistook patience for superiority. Privilege masqueraded as professionalism. They thought the right tie and the right phrasing made them untouchable. Meanwhile, courage, real courage, was rebranded as chaos. When Crockett defended herself with calm precision, the smirks only deepened. When she refused to shrink, they called her defiant. When she smiled through an insult, they said she was playing victim. Every move she made was a mirror they couldn't stand to face. In those moments, silence wasn't respect. It was dismissal. The same kind of silence that now filled the Senate chamber as Warren spoke her name. But the difference this time was who controlled it. The quiet no longer belonged to the powerful, because while they laughed, someone had been listening. While they dismissed her, someone had been watching, someone who recognized that silence not as decorum, but as erasure. Before she became a face on the Senate floor screens, before the cameras and the noise, Jasmine Crockett was just a young woman trying to be heard in rooms that mistook silence for grace. In law school, she learned early that justice was rarely polite. She'd raise her hand to challenge an outdated argument, and a professor would sigh, not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't supposed to question the way things had always been done. That was the first lesson. The system doesn't need to tell you no if it can teach you to doubt your yes. So she stopped asking for permission. She learned to speak not louder but sharper. Every sentence became a scalpel, precise, unflinching, surgical. She joined protests, volunteered for pro bono defense, stood beside people the law forgot, and learned that advocacy wasn't about echoing the loudest voice. It was about giving shape to the quiet truth. When she entered politics, she brought that same discipline with her. The courtroom had taught her that power bends for no one. It must be met, measured, and challenged. But in Congress, she discovered a different kind of battle. Here, the game wasn't about facts. It was about optics. Men who'd never read a case file lectured her about tone. Commentators called her fiery, as if passion were a flaw. Every question she asked, every rebuttal she delivered was dissected like a scandal. But she didn't flinch. She'd been here before, not this building, but this dynamic. She knew what it meant to make people uncomfortable simply by existing in full color, in full truth. Her secret weapon wasn't volume or vengeance. It was calm. In hearings, she'd sit forward slightly, listening as opponents unraveled their own contradictions. Her responses were measured, her gaze unwavering. When one colleague tried to talk over her mid-sentence, she paused, waited, then continued in the same even tone, as if the interruption hadn't existed at all. That poise became her signature. The crowd online began calling it Crockett composure, and that composure wasn't rehearsed. It was resilience refined. Every insult polished her focus. Every condescending smile taught her that anger could be quiet and still burn. She didn't need to shout. She needed only to be undeniable. In private, she carried her grandmother's words like armor. Don't waste your breath proving who you are to people committed to misunderstanding you. That became her creed, to speak only when truth demanded it, and to do so without apology. So when the hearings grew heated, when cameras caught her steady eyes cutting through chaos, it wasn't performance. It was clarity, the kind that unsettles those who thrive on noise. People watching from home saw something rare, a woman who refused to contort herself to fit the room. She didn't seek acceptance. She demanded respect through excellence. And in a political culture addicted to outrage, that kind of quiet defiance felt revolutionary. And perhaps that's why Warren noticed, because courage recognizes its reflection. Because Warren, too, had stood in rooms that underestimated her. Because she understood the discipline it takes to stand tall without shouting, to stay gracious while being undermined. 2 women, 2 generations, 1 principle, that truth doesn't need permission to exist. So when Warren stood to speak, no one expected what came next. The Senate chamber was restless that afternoon, a hum of shifting papers, whispered side comments, the low buzz of cameras capturing everything. C-SPAN's red light glowed steadily at the back, its unblinking eye waiting for something worth remembering. And then Elizabeth Warren rose from her seat. The noise softened instinctively, like the room knew to listen before she even spoke. She began not with accusation, but with principle. In moments of deep division, she said, it becomes easy to mistake cruelty for conviction, and silence for strength. Her tone was even, controlled, the voice of someone who'd spent a lifetime making truth sound undeniable. At first, no one suspected where she was going. Her words floated between policy and morality, speaking of fairness, representation, the integrity of leadership. A few senators nodded absently. Others returned to their notes, assuming it was just another procedural address. But her rhythm began to change, slower, more deliberate. Every word seemed to gather weight. There are people in public service, she continued, who face ridicule not for their failures, but for their courage to speak with clarity in rooms that try to drown them out. Heads lifted. The hum stopped. Then she said it. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the unwavering clarity and courage of Representative Jasmine Crockett. It landed like a strike of thunder muffled in velvet. The air thickened. Chairs stilled. One senator's pen froze mid-note. Somewhere in the back, a cough started and died half-born. No one moved. No one dared. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged, heavy with recognition and discomfort. In politics, applause can be polite, but silence means impact. It means something sacred just crossed the floor. Cameras zoomed in on Warren's face, calm, resolute, almost serene. She wasn't looking for a reaction. She was delivering one. Across the nation, millions watched in real time, trying to decide whether this was a gesture of solidarity or an act of defiance. In truth, it was both. A praise, yes, but also a reckoning. Because when Warren said her name, she didn't just elevate Crockett. She exposed everyone who had tried to belittle her, but it was what Warren said next that no one saw coming. Warren didn't pause. She didn't blink. The silence she'd created became her stage, and she stepped into it with absolute calm. In times when truth is treated as aggression, she said, her voice gaining quiet force, clarity becomes a revolution. The words struck like flint, soft in sound, sharp in meaning. Every senator in the chamber knew what she was doing now. This was no polite acknowledgement. This was a declaration. Representative Crockett has faced the storm with composure, Warren continued, defending truth against the temptation of spectacle. When others sought a headline, she sought accuracy. When others raised their voices, she raised the standard. A few senators shifted uncomfortably. Others stared straight ahead, hands folded, pretending not to feel the tension rising like static. But it was there, undeniable, pulsing in the air. Cameras caught every moment. The slight nod of agreement from a staffer in the back row, the half-smile from a senator who knew she was witnessing something larger than politics. And somewhere, miles away in her office, Jasmine Crockett watched in stunned silence. The feed was playing on mute. But she could read every word from Warren's lips. Calm, deliberate, each phrase landing like a drumbeat of validation. It wasn't just that Warren was praising her. It was how she was doing it, naming her courage in a space that rarely named women like her at all. She reminded this country, Warren went on, that integrity doesn't need theatrics, that passion and precision can coexist, and that when a woman speaks with purpose, the volume of her truth cannot be measured by the comfort of those who fear it. A faint sound rippled through the chamber, a single clap. Then another, hesitant, awkward, but real. Applause in the Senate is rare, but that day it began to spread like the quiet start of a storm. On screen, Crockett leaned forward in disbelief. She wasn't smiling, not yet. It was something deeper than pride, something steadier. Validation mixed with vulnerability. A sense that, for once, someone in power had seen her. Not as a spectacle, but as a standard. Warren raised her head slightly, her tone softening. "It's easy to stand tall when the wind is at your back," she said. "But it takes a different kind of strength to keep standing when the wind is meant to break you." The room went still again. Even her critics, the ones who'd rolled their eyes when she began, were quiet now, caught between admiration and unease. Then Warren delivered the line that sealed it all. And in that moment, she said, the Senate didn't feel divided by party, but by principle. The applause swelled. Not thunderous, not unanimous, but undeniable. It was the sound of a room momentarily stripped of politics, a room remembering its humanity. On the broadcast, the camera lingered on Warren's face, poised, unflinching, and then cut to Crockett's silent reaction. Her eyes shimmered, not from emotion alone, but from recognition. Two women, separated by distance, connected by defiance. This wasn't just praise. It was mentorship, validation, and resistance woven into one act of courage. A hand extended across the aisle, across generations, across expectations, saying without words, "You are not alone in this fight." And while Warren's words echoed through the chamber, their aftershocks would ignite something far beyond D.C. The speech ended, but the silence it left behind was only temporary. Within hours, the moment detonated online. C-SPAN clips turned into TikToks. News outlets replayed the exchange in slow motion, and hashtags began to surge. Warren Crockett moment. Respect speaks. A truth without fear. It wasn't just political junkies who paid attention. It was everyone. Students in law schools shared the clip with captions like, "This is why I chose this path." Young women in debate clubs stitched reactions eyes wide, saying, "She said what we've all been waiting to hear." Even commentators who usually thrived on outrage found themselves pausing, replaying, recalibrating. Networks scrambled to frame it. CNN called it a masterclass in moral clarity. Fox News, cautiously but notably, labeled it unexpectedly unifying. Podcasts dissected every inflection of Warren's voice, every flicker of expression in Crockett's eyes. Then came the bipartisan surprise. A few senators who rarely agree with anything publicly admitted admiration. "You could feel the weight of it," one said quietly. Politics aside, it was respect. In a world where performative outrage often overshadowed principle, Warren's words felt radical in their restraint. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She'd simply spoken truth with precision, and that made people listen. The emotional resonance ran deeper than headlines. For many watching, especially women of color in law and public service, it wasn't just validation. It was vindication. It said, your voice doesn't have to conform to be credible. Your truth doesn't have to be softened to be heard. Clips circulated with slowed piano music, cinematic edits, and quotes overlaid. It wasn't just a speech. It was permission for authenticity to exist in power. By midnight, the clip had tens of millions of views. By morning, think pieces called it a turning point in tone, a reminder that courage could be calm. That strength could sound like sincerity, and yet, as the internet dissected the moment from every angle, one truth remained clear. The real impact didn't come from the applause. It came from what Elizabeth Warren said next, her closing line, the one that silenced even the commentators. When the chamber finally exhaled, Warren looked out across the silent sea of faces and delivered the line that would etch the moment into memory. Her voice was calm, unwavering, the kind of tone that carries not through volume, but through truth. Dignity doesn't shout. It stands. The words floated, then settled. Not as sound, but as stillness. No one reached for applause right away. No one dared to speak. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was sacred. A space carved out for reflection, for reckoning, for respect. Some senators shifted, eyes lowered. Others just stared ahead as if afraid to break the fragile calm that had replaced the usual noise of debate. In that instant, power didn't look like dominance. It looked like restraint. And somewhere across town, in a quiet congressional office, Jasmine Crockett sat watching the live feed. She didn't smile. She didn't clap. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words wash over her like a benediction. For years, she'd spoken truth in rooms that tried to shrink her, held her composure under fire, and refused to let mockery rewrite her purpose. And now, someone had stood for her, not as a shield, but as an equal. That was the real revelation. Not that Warren had spoken, but that she had seen. Because when recognition is sincere, it doesn't just validate, it multiplies courage. And when respect is voiced out loud, it becomes something healing, something contagious. Outside the chamber, the headlines continued, the hashtags multiplied, the narratives spun. But inside, for those who witnessed it firsthand, something deeper remained, a rare reminder that integrity can still command a room, that solidarity still means something. The Senate, that historic theater of ego and ideology, had, for one fleeting moment, remembered its capacity for grace, and as the applause finally began, slow, reverent, growing in waves, the cameras captured more than politics. They captured the quiet power of two women who refused to be small, and in doing so, made the entire room rise. And as the applause faded, one truth lingered in the air. Elizabeth Warren praised Jasmine Crockett. And for once, words were enough to silence the room. In an age where shouting has become the soundtrack of politics, this moment reminded the nation what real influence sounds like. Calm, clear, and anchored in purpose. No theatrics, no grandstanding, just dignity, standing tall where arrogance once tried to dominate, because sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't to raise your voice, it's to own it. To speak truth without fear, to stand your ground when others would rather see you shrink. Warren's words didn't just honor Crockett. They honored every woman, every outsider, every person told they were too much or too loud just for daring to exist in their full power. It was solidarity wrapped in grace, and for a rare, unforgettable moment, even the most cynical corners of the chamber understood, and that's why this moment matters. Because dignity will always outlast noise, integrity will always outshine spectacle, and courage, the kind that speaks softly but truthfully, will always echo longer than applause. If you believe in courage over conformity, subscribe. If you believe truth still has a place in public life, share this story, because every time you amplify authenticity, you remind the world that empathy and strength can coexist. That conviction doesn't have to come with cruelty. That leadership can still look like composure. The next generation is watching, and what they see depends on what we choose to celebrate. So let's make sure they know authenticity isn't a weakness. It's power. Visual fades in an empty Senate chamber. Paper still. Microphone untouched. the faint echo of Warren's final words still lingering in the air. Dignity doesn't shout. It stands. Soft piano music swells. The camera lingers on the emptiness, not as loss, but as peace. Then, the screen fades to black. Text appears, simple and quiet. The future belongs to those who speak with truth. Fade out.